swag dash next thing we know. Well, thank you for that. And thanks, Jeff, for the introduction and especially for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to read my remarks today because that will keep me on time and on topic. Those are good things. So I want to talk about three things in this order. First, I want to talk a bit about trade-offs. Second, about trade-offs and happiness. And then third, about happiness and income. So I'll start with trade-offs. I shall never own my dream car. And not just because I could never afford it. My dream car would be matchless in propelling me off the line, unparalleled in hurling me around corners, and it would let me drop its roof anytime I wanted to feel the wind in my scalp.
Honda S2000.
It's a good, well, it's a good compromise. But it's a compromise. Now, why is it a compromise? Well, a car without a fixed roof is less rigid, and flexibility compromises handling. Of course, we could stiffen the chassis, but that adds weight, and weight compromises acceleration. Quick, nimble, windblown. Pick any two. The reason I shall never own my dream car is that it's only in dreams that one avoids the necessity of trade-offs. Now, I also face trade-offs when it comes to my dream life. In my dream life, I have ambitions that give my life meaning, ambitions for my own present and future endeavors, but also for the sake of my children, my friends, and other persons whose happiness in life is part of my own. Of course, in my dream life, I am also satisfied, and I am also smiling and free from worry and stress along the way. But the catch is that those dreamed of ambitions take extra resources, and putting in the last hours to earn those last dollars sometimes compromises smiling and freedom from stress. The happiness of a life has many parts, and between these parts there are many trade-offs, even many wise trade-offs that different people might make between the feelings of happiness on the one hand and the rest of happiness on the other. These trade-offs confront us everywhere, and they go a very long way toward making our choices what they are. Now, I bring up trade-offs because one of the most important things to know about the area of social scientific research on happiness that I'll be focusing on is that it cannot see these sorts of choices for what they are, namely trade-offs between the feelings of happiness and the rest of happiness. When researchers in the area that I'm interested in study happiness, what they study are the feelings of happiness, or what they call subjective well-being. So that's going to be my focus. If you recall from Mark's talk this morning, I'm going to focus on subjective well-being, and in particular, the hedonic and the evaluative aspects of it, as opposed to the eudaimonic, which I'm also happy to talk about later. Now, this is not because they suppose that subjective well-being is all there is to happiness, but rather because it is all there is to happiness that this study is in a position to study. Or as Ed Diener puts it, there are additional features of a valuable life and of mental health, but the field of SWB, subjective well-being, focuses on people's own evaluations of their lives. What this means is that, I'll just abbreviate this happiness science, knowing that I just mean this particular area of it. What this means is that happiness science studies only one side of the trade-offs people make for the sake of their overall happiness. The practical upshot of this methodological constraint is that happiness science, therefore, is not in a position to guide policymakers about the overall effects of happiness, about the overall effects on happiness of public policies bearing on the different trade-offs people might choose. I think that's relevant to this morning's talk as well, with the talk of, especially the mention of respecting people's preferences. Now, so far there's no complaint. This is simply to note where the boundaries are. And yet, making such judgments and offering such guidance are the very things that happiness science is frequently advertised to be for. It's an input to a public policy process that outputs policies to increase public happiness. For example, and this will be my pet example, but we could certainly substitute others. Diener and his colleagues write that the justification for a graduated income tax is that taking away a greater percentage of income from the rich will affect their happiness little, whereas taxes can substantially lower the happiness of the poor. So from this perspective, the issue of taxation at the margin is very simple. If the last dollar doesn't make for much more subjective well-being, then it should always be harmless to tax the last dollar. But setting aside the always complicated question of just where to set marginal tax rates, and I want to be clear that that's actually not what I'm interested in, there is a crucial question about this rationale for setting them. That's really the question. Because this rationale is based on research that cannot see the trade-offs that might be surrounding the last dollar earned. More precisely, this area of research cannot know how to assess trade-offs related to income for the sake of overall happiness. Actually, I'm going to argue that it does not know how to assess the effects of such trade-offs even on subjective well-being. So much for trade-offs. Let's talk about trade-offs and happiness. And I want to start with an important, a perennial question. I want to think about Robert Downey Jr. How might we measure how happy he is today? You're looking at me like our students do. Why are we talking about Robert Downey Jr.? Well, wait and see. To simplify it, let's focus on just one dimension of happiness, namely how satisfied he might feel about his life today. That's one aspect among many of subjective well-being. It's one of the evaluative aspects. Now, the Robert Downey Jr. that my students know is, of course, a successful and beloved actor. But my Robert Downey Jr., my generation's Robert Downey Jr., also includes the Robert Downey Jr. whose life was once ruined by addiction to heroin. My students will often think, I don't remember that film. Yeah, right. No, that was the evening news. Film. So, how might Robert Downey Jr. respond if we were to survey him with the satisfaction with life scale? And here's that scale. We have several items over here. In most ways, my life is close to my ideal. The conditions of my life are excellent, and so on. And these are all supposed to be, different ways in which a person might assess satisfaction. And each of them, you can give a numeric answer from 1 to 7, either strongly agree or strongly disagree. Now, to simplify further, so Robert Downey Jr. takes the satisfaction with life scale. Well, let's simplify further by just taking 2 items. That's all we'll need. Let's take these 2. The first, in most ways, my life is close to my ideal. And the last one, if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. Now, let's suppose that Robert Downey Jr. agrees strongly on the first item and answers 6. No one answers 7. But let's suppose that he gives a very strong answer, 6, out of the possible 7. Sounds plausible to me. But it also sounds plausible to me that he would strongly disagree on the other item. There is a big chunk of his life that he lost and can never get back. So let's suppose that he answers 2 on the second item. We now add these responses together for a combined response of 8. Question: what exactly does that number 8 mean? Notice that the satisfaction with life scale assigns responses on different items equal relative weights. So his answer to the first weighs as much as his answer to the second. He just tot them up. Any difference, though, in how Robert Downey Jr. might weight those two responses is the difference between very different ways he might experience his life. If he experiences his life today as very satisfying, then he assigns much less weight to his past, bad as it was. So it's not a matter of pretending that his past was less bad. It's a matter of deciding now, how bad is it that it was that bad? A very different Robert Downey Jr. might give so much weight to his lost past that he derives little satisfaction from his present success, good as it is. It all depends on the weights he assigns to these two evaluations of his life, but that information is missing. So ironically, his satisfaction with life is one thing the satisfaction with life scale doesn't tell us. But even setting aside the question of how to combine responses, we could, not without complication, but we could introduce weights on a revised version. But even setting that aside, there remains the deeper assumption that these scores can be meaningfully combined in the first place, and it is not obvious that they can. $6 and $2 make $8, but $6 and 2 miles don't make 8 of anything. Is adding Robert Downey Jr.'s responses rather more like adding dollars and dollars, or more like adding dollars and miles? To be sure, he can answer the first question with a number if he must, and he can answer the second question with a number if he must. But why would we suppose that there must be any single metric to which those two numbers belong? Worse, these difficulties compound as we broaden our perspective because problems of weighting and commensurability arise not only within a dimension like satisfaction with life, they also arise between dimensions such as satisfaction and other dimensions of subjective well-being, such as pleasure, and there are numerous others. Someone who finds her job deeply satisfying may also find it not very pleasant. But how she weights those two dimensions of subjective well-being is what makes the difference between being very happy with that job, it's a pain, but it's the life for me, and being very unhappy with that job. It's important what I do, but I hate it. Likewise, there is no reason to suppose that she would experience a low pleasure score as simply canceled out by a high satisfaction score. If these difficulties of weighting and commensurability are tricky within and between different dimensions of subjective well-being, they're actually insurmountable when they are between all the other elements of an overall happy life on the one hand, and that element of a happy life that is subjective well-being on the other hand. Even someone who experiences a difficult job as very low when it comes to subjective well-being, taken as a whole, and whatever it means to take that as a whole, that person may nonetheless find doing that job to be a crucial ingredient in a life that he or she finds valuable, meaningful, and even deeply fulfilling. And that fulfillment might make all the difference to that person for the sake of a happy life. There is, after all, more to a happy life than the feelings of happiness. Now, the study of happiness that I'm interested in measures parts, but it has not the resources for judging wholes. Since the trade-offs we choose for the sake of happiness are choices about happiness as a whole, that research cannot judge which of these trade-offs might be more effective for the sake of happiness that we most care about. So now let's talk about income. Even if, I've talked about other people's boundaries, let me talk about mine. Even if happiness science can't tell us much about income and happiness overall, this much broader conception of happiness, it may still have a lot to say about the relation of income to subjective well-being, and that is well worth knowing. Now, interestingly, at present, the answer seems to differ depending on which dimension of subjective well-being we looked at. And this research was mentioned earlier as well. So we're gonna turn over some rocks. So let's go back to to this chart. The whole paper is in this graph. It's a brilliant graph. This paper by Kahneman and Deaton. Okay. According to this research by Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton, although there is a linear correlation between reported overall life satisfaction and doubling units of household income, or in other words, a log linear correlation, and that's on the z-axis over here. The same is not true for emotions, like positive affect, freedom from worry and sadness, or freedom from stress. I should explain what we mean by mean ladder. You're thinking, did they open for the Ramones in the 70s? That's average ladder score as reported. So you ask people at different household levels the Cantrell ladder, given the Cantrell ladder survey, which was mentioned this morning. Imagine there's a ladder. The 0 rung is the worst life for you. The 10th rung is the best life for you. Which rung would you say you're on? People can give not just am I satisfied or not, but how satisfied approximately am I with my life. Okay. All right. What Kahneman and Deaton found was that beyond a point, about $75,000 a year, the correlation between household income and emotional well-being, the yellow curves, is almost completely flat. The implications for tax policy seem clear. Beyond $75,000, taxing the last dollar earned should be particularly harmless, at least with respect to emotional or experiential happiness. Now, there is a serious methodological complication in Kahneman and Deaton's study. Whereas they compare household income with average degrees of life satisfaction on the z-axis on the right, they compare household income not with degrees of emotional well-being on the y-axis, but with the likelihood of either reporting positive emotional well-being or not. In other words, they use a continuous measure for satisfaction, but a dichotomous measure for emotional well-being. So what? Well, the difference matters because a dichotomous measure can actually generate thresholds when continuous measures are linear. In fact, they can do that even for one and the same attribute. Let me show you. If we correlated the average height of adolescence with age, we would probably find that average height continues to increase as teens get older. If we also measured height dichotomously, say whether the teens were taller than 5 feet 6 inches or not, we would find a threshold age beyond which many teens not taller than 5'6" have reached their full height. Paradoxically, just by using both a continuous measure and a dichotomous measure, we discover that the correlation between age and height in teenagers both is and is not linear. But that paradox is fake because that's just how the two types of measures function. Now, this methodological complication, I think, has significant philosophical implications, which again point up the importance of weighting, commensurability, and trade-offs. One implication concerns the meaning of the threshold that Kahneman and Deaton found, which they have each interpreted in the media as showing that as people earn more income, they feel no better emotionally. Robert Frank has given us gave this interpretation after the study came out. We have more details. It turns out there is a specific dollar number or income plateau after which more money has no measurable effect on day-to-day contentment. Earn another dollar, you're no happier. The magic income, $75,000 a year. As people earn more money, their day-to-day happiness rises until you hit $75,000. After that, it's just more stuff, no gain in happiness. And he quotes what Angus Deaton told the Associated Press: giving people more income beyond $75,000 is not going to do much for their daily mood, but it is going to make them feel they have a better life. So they'll be higher on satisfaction. It does nothing for emotional well-being. In a widely viewed TED Talk, Daniel Kahneman gave a very similar interpretation. Clearly what's happening is money doesn't buy you experiential happiness, emotional happiness. But lack of money buys you misery, and we can measure the misery very, very clearly. In terms of life satisfaction, you get a different story. The more money you earn, the more satisfied you are. That doesn't hold for the emotions. So with satisfaction, there are improvements beyond the threshold, no improvements for the emotions. Well, I suggest that the threshold doesn't show that, for the simple reason that they didn't measure the differences in degree of emotional well-being. Just as our dichotomous measure of height didn't measure the further growth of teenagers taller than 5'6". Want to get taller as a kid? Hit 5'6", may as well stop now. What Kahneman and Deaton found was that as households became richer, members of those households still experienced sadness, worry, and stress at a fairly constant level of probability. But this does not show that one's emotional experience doesn't improve, even that it doesn't improve where those very emotions are concerned. The stress of a young, low-income person, is usually the stress of living hand to mouth. Actually, you can go from graduate student to postdoc, I reckon, and there's a pretty big improvement. The stress of someone further on in a career, though, is often the stress of having too many worthwhile things to do at once. There's the good stress and the bad stress that we heard about earlier. I've experienced both. I doubt that many people who have experienced the second sort of stress would ever trade it again for the first sort of stress. So even though some form of stress remains, even at higher income levels, it doesn't follow that one is no better off emotionally, even where stress itself is concerned. One trades one kind of emotional life for another, and the trade can be wonderful, even if it can't be perfect. Another way to look at their findings is to ask whether income above $75,000 a year is an emotional disappointment relative to what expectations. Kahneman and Deaton found, let's just focus on this one, they found that once household income reaches about $75,000, there is a peak probability of nearly 0.9 that on any given day a member of such a household will report things like happiness and smiling. I have to pause and ask, if we had found the threshold at 100% chance, every man jack of them, that would be the greatest news ever. Why is 0.9 supposed to be so embarrassing and devastating? Moving on. So if we imagine, what does that 0.9 mean? Here's what the 0.9 means. If we imagine two well-to-do households of 5 members each, on average, there will be one person or other of those households who does, say that one, who doesn't report happiness and smiling on any given day when asked on a survey. It doesn't have to be the same one, just has to be someone. Without a doubt, these findings show that into every life a little rain must fall, even lives lived in households receiving more than $75,000 a year. But the question is, who could have hoped for anything different? Observe that in the US anyway, this is census data. I meant to put a URL there, but I've got it in my notes. In the US, as households get richer, they also tend to have more members as well as older heads of households. So the composition of the households changes dramatically as we go up the income scale. One thing this means is that many richer households include older parents sending their children to university. And it's hardly surprising that both parent and child have their own burdens to bear, $75,000 notwithstanding. In households like these, the parents work more demanding jobs so as to give their children better educational prospects, choosing to work the last hours, stressful as they are, to earn the last dollars to fund their children's studies, stressful as they are too. This, I think, is the sort of trade-off that reasonable people actually take themselves to be making between income and emotional well-being, and the threshold does not show that those expectations are generally disappointing. Think of the amazing world we live in which most people can expect to send their kids to school, expect to send their kids to university. I mean, more than has ever been possible in human history. And the fact that someone says, I'm going to earn the money and I'm going to do that, and if it costs me stress, so be it. This is a good life for me. It's an amazing trade-off that people now, for the first time in human history, have the opportunity to make. Why does it look like a failure? Now, how much does all this matter? So there's a log linear correlation between household income and life satisfaction, although we don't know as much about household income and emotional well-being, I suggest. But suppose that that correlation turns out to be log linear too. Would that be any less a reason to increase taxes on the last dollar earned where subjective well-being is concerned? Well, Diener and his colleagues say no, because a log linear correlation means that subjective well-being increases in proportion not with the next dollar, but with the next doubling of household income. Quite simply, the last dollar can never buy as much subjective well-being as any dollar before. So again, taxing the last dollar should be fairly harmless where subjective well-being is concerned. But whatever marginal tax rates should be, and I don't know, this rationale for where they should be is mistaken, I think, for the simple reason that it ignores what economists call compensating differentials. Suppose you are offered a job in a butcher shop and also a job in a flower shop for this very same pay. This is what we call very, very easy. Do you want to spend your workday in a place that's covered in offal or in a place that's scented with gardenias, if both pay the same? Your total compensation is made up of both monetary and non-monetary benefits, and as Smith observed, the less the non-monetary benefits, the more monetary benefits are required to make up the shortfall and attract workers away from other more pleasant jobs they might take instead. So in other words, often the whole point of the last dollar just is to offset the fact that the job isn't a very happy job to do. Of course, what all this means is that the last dollar is part of a trade-off. And whether and when it might be wise to accept that trade-off brings us immediately back to thinking about the happiness of one's whole life. So, in order to make all things considered recommendations about taxing the last dollar earned, subjective well-being science would have to make judgments about the wisdom of trade-offs between income and subjective well-being that people make for the sake of their happiness as a whole. Because that's where policy is going to hit. But it is precisely with respect to happiness as a whole that science has and can have no resources. Again, my point is not about taxes. My point is that whatever anyone's tax bill ought to be, as soon as happiness scientists become advisors on public policies of this sort, their advice to policymakers is, in effect, to focus on the feelings of happiness and ignore the rest of happiness. That advice, I think, cannot be wise. And it cannot be just either. Ed Diener argues that the point of focusing on subjective well-being in the first place is to remain democratic. This subjective definition of quality of life, he says, is democratic in that it grants to each individual the right to decide whether his or her life is worthwhile. And fair enough. But then, mustn't it also be democratic to grant to each individual the right to decide whether his or her trade-offs in life are worthwhile? Trade-offs. Subjective well-being science can't live with them. And as long as that science continues to make all things considered judgments about public policy, it can't live without them either. Thanks.